Yate, good afternoon. Leola Tsinnajinnie Paquin Nishia, Filipino Nishla, Tsinnajinnie Bashichin, Filipino Dashache, Tsinnajinnie Dashanala, Nat Naljin Dant Nasha, Rio Rancho de Shagan, University of New Mexico de Nashnish. So thank you so much for being here. My name is Leola Tsinnajinnie Paquin, and I will be presenting today on a course I've poured my heart and soul into. So I really appreciate all of you taking the time to join me to hear more about it. So I'll tell you more about it in these first few slides. So go ahead and start the show. By show, I mean slideshow, not like show. So anyways, these are like my favorite words I put together because it's really, like I said, I put my heart and soul into this course, but I don't just talk about the course in this presentation, but a lot of the different activities that connect to the course and the things I do as a Native Studies professor, as a community member, and just, trying to be a good relative. So teaching Native American Studies for Indigenous educational sovereignty and anti-racism, centering core values and relationships in virtual spaces. So oftentimes we hear different conceptions of what it's like to take an online class or maybe Zoom in. And this is something that in Native Studies we've considered for a long time because we've really been concerned about having access, giving our community members, deepest in the far reaches of our lands, access to education. So even prior to the pandemic, it's something we invested a lot of time and effort into. For myself, I really gravitated toward the introduction to Native American Studies class because I feel that's where, we have the most reach of, people willing to dip their toes into the class for various reasons. And I'll get into that as we go along. So just a few disclaimers about this presentation. I hope you stay, but I wanted to give you a few disclaimers just in case that this might not be what you are thinking you signed on for. But a lot of the tone and the slides I share, the work I do, it's very personal because my journey into my positionality in this informs my teaching. So I share a lot about my family, my experiences, how that ties into those of my students. The images, don't want to get in trouble with sharing anything that's private, from my students or the far reaches of the internet. So I just share a lot of my own personal images. I ended up just pulling a bunch of things from my Facebook, so the quality might not be as good as it should be. When I think when you're sharing again, you kind of lose the digital effect. So I also like food. I think food symbolizes a lot. And so you'll see a lot of food in this presentation. Hopefully it'll keep you attentive. And, I make a lot of attempts at humor. Hopefully it doesn't fall too flat, but just wanted to give you that disclaimer. And so, with that kind of style, it might not be the most academic in the traditional sense of academia. And also just my vibe right now, I'm pretty distraught over the new mandates that have been coming down in terms of especially in schools, to where there's no more mask mandates. And for me, that's kind of hard to accept because I have one kid who hasn't been able to be vaccinated, and in his class, no kids are wearing masks. This is my 3-year-old. And then in my other kindergartner, my other kid, he is probably one of just a few kids in his class who's wearing a mask. So I'm pretty on edge over that. So that's kind of the context of my presentation as well. And then second, I'm going to be up for promotion and tenure this coming calendar year. And so my objective is I really have to demonstrate that what I'm doing makes an impact. And I have to be clear about that for those who might not be, sitting at the table with me, having these really good fruitful conversations. I have to make it clear to the guy, and I don't mean to pick on the history department, but the guy in the history department or the math department. I'll pick on math because my brother's in math, or just any other department that might not have this community-centered focus. And so because I have to tout myself as clearly as possible, but that might not come across as me being able to center community-centered values as much. So just a heads up there. And I'm going through pretty bad imposter syndrome right now. So again, just disclaimers I wanted to share with you. And on that note, I just wanted to reiterate again, thank you so much for sharing your time with me, because I know our time is precious. Whatever time we have, we try to squeeze so much out of each other, and especially these virtual circumstances. So with that, I will get into the nuts and bolts of my presentation. And thank you for the well wishes on my PNT process. So what I'm going to share with you mostly focuses on work I've put into my online Introduction to Native American Studies course. And so this is kind of like a sampling from what my syllabus text looks like. So I introduced myself right away with that I'm Filipino. I identify as Diné as well, and she, her, hers pronouns. And instead of saying office hours, I say drop-in hours to make this as welcoming as possible. And so, some of these are tools I've been learning along the way with different fellowships I've been involved in. And so instead of a course description, right here you see on the left side of your screen, I wrote a description of the presentation. So in this presentation, I will share how I've used my experiences, conceptions of educational sovereignty, training and virtual learning, and fellowships to enhance the first experience many students will have in NAS. And the ultimate purpose is, as you'll see as I go through my slides, it's just moving towards Indigenous community wellness. And in this picture I share with you here, it's a pretend picture, so you see the same background. I saw on Facebook, this tip to take a picture of your office and use that as your virtual background to pretend that you're in your office. So I just like it. So I use that. And this picture I took last week. I was presenting with my colleagues a keynote to Santa Fe Community College. And the overall title of the keynote was Honoring Our Relationships Through Solidarity, Collective Power in Higher Education for Social Justice, with my colleagues, Dr. Siv Desai, Nancy Lopez, and Vincent Orbito. And the reason I wanted to share that with you is just to show the extent of places that I've been able to go on my own, but especially with my colleagues throughout the state in terms of really promoting anti-racism, Indigenous education, a lot of these concepts that I'll be discussing today. So I'll share more about that later on in the presentation. So I wanted to share my journey, we also say pathway. Today I decided to say, my educational hike or my river of life. Dr. Balone learned that from you, river of life. Just describing the process of moving through one chapter in life to the next, as it intermingles personally and professionally, educationally. So for me, I got most of my primary education through Torreon Day School. It was a BIE school for all the years that I went through it, that my brother and sister went through it. And then for high school, I went to St. Kate's. So shout out to Marvina, anyone else who went to St. Kate's or family legacy in St. Kate's. And then I decided to go in a completely different direction and just try out massive public education. So I went to the University of Arizona and I studied sociology. Sociology was great. I learned so much about, the way structures work, especially as it pertains to people of color and education, social inequality. But I found that Native people were barely mentioned. You had to take a specific class focused on, minorities to get to actually read articles about American Indians. And so with that, I thought, this is great to learn about, but I didn't take American Indian Studies classes until my senior year because I had these weird conceptions about what AIS really was. And I didn't realize until my senior year, like, oh, this is what it's about. And this is, you study Native experiences and it's centered in Indigenous scholarship, Indigenous history, Indigenous policy. And by then it was a little too late to really study AIS as a minor. At the time, they didn't have the major yet, but I was able to apply for the master's program. And so that's where my interest really took off. And unfortunately, I still see that as a parallel to the experiences I have with my students. A lot of them don't take NAS 1150 until like their senior year because, you know, they weren't pulled into it for whatever reason. They didn't know about it. And by then it's too late for them to major or minor in it, but they love it. And so that's something that, you know, we're working toward changing. So if all of you guys and women, girls, gentlemen, everyone, if you could help us promote NAS, say, hey, take a class with Leola or Lloyd Lee or any one of us. I'll introduce you to everyone. But that would be great, you know, early on. So we really kind of get the opportunity to say, you know, this is what NAS is all about. And it really is about, you know, trying to support our communities, our families, our children. So anyhow, you guys remember Futures for Children? Well, I worked there for a year. I took a year off between my bachelor's and master's degree. And it was then that I realized, you know, I really want to serve Native communities, but I love school, and my whole life was centered around the school calendar. Both my parents are educators, and I just wanted that school life forever. So at that time, that's when I decided, when I go back for my master's, I'm going to do my best to try to make myself marketable as a PhD candidate. So that's what my focus was when I went back for my master's degree in AIS. And I was able to learn about the program in LLSS at UNM. And at that time, I just wanted to be home. I had enough time being away, and I just wanted to be home. And so I was able to do that. And I was able to be a graduate assistant for IAIE. So, you know, the institute that's hosting me now as a professor, I was able to support it and be supported by it as a graduate assistant. And then once I completed my PhD, I was able to teach at SIPI for a couple of years and, you know, really experience the SIPI version of educational sovereignty, and to serve students from so many reaches of Native nations. And it was just such a privilege and honor to be able to do that, and to meet my my dear colleague Danielle Lansing. She was going to try to join. I don't know if she was able to yet, but she was just, you know, phenomenal in the SIPI experience, and we form a lifelong bond and relationship over that. And then I was able to come back to UNM, which has always been my dream from my Futures for Children days. My dream has been to be a professor in NAS at UNM. So focusing in on the Intro to NAS course, I got to teach it as a teaching assistant and then an adjunct. When I was at SIPI, I adjuncted for UNM, and then I began my career as an early assistant professor with teaching face-to-face. So that's me, that, you know, I'm blurry, but I'm pregnant in that picture, teaching my face-to-face class. And that's where I kind of really developed these activities that I ended up turning into virtual activities that I'll be sharing with you in the upcoming slides. So my first online class was in 2016. It was a bit of a mess compared to what it is now, but it worked. You know, I just started to make that transition in 2016. I was also have been a part of the Diversity Council Curriculum Subcommittee. So this is the committee that oversees the diversity requirement that all students must pass to graduate from UNM. It's just one little thing that we can do as a university to see that students get some sort of experience that's focused on US global diversity and equity and inclusion. So I've been an assistant professor for a really long time. So I started in 2015. As I mentioned, I haven't been up for tenure yet. I've had two kids along the way, and in COVID, I took the extra year off, the extra year to prepare for a promotion and tenure, just because of there's just so much going on, and there's so much pressure, you know, to be able to feel like I'm at a standpoint where I'm confident in, I have all the evidence necessary that I can say, look, I've done all this in teaching, all this in my scholarship that, please, keep me for the long term. So anyways, I've been an assistant professor for a long time, and along the way, I've invested a lot in the class that I've shared in my description. So I got online certification, and then I've got Golden Paw certification. So I elevated it there, and then I tried to really dig into it in terms of the research aspect of it and the student experience aspect of it. So with all that effort and energy, I wanted to start off with a poem that one of my students wrote. Like I said before, sometimes there's this idea of, what could you really, what connection can you really make in an online class? So this is one of my favorite pieces of evidence in terms of what can happen in an online environment. So this is from Aaron Iachabi. He was my online student in 2020. So he writes about the class. From all generations near and far, we come together only for a while, becoming another light like a star, illuminating the darkness on what is so vile, uncovering hidden truths to only which the few will acknowledge, our eyes seeing the unnecessary pain to which the mind can only understand, turning a spot on a heart to a stain, body calling for action on demand, pushing forward towards the justice that is so deserved. And so what he says in this description of his poem, he says it was just us as people coming together to explore our Indigenous side, to further understand the history of injustices and perseverance our people have experienced, also to develop ourselves to know that we are what our people depend on to ensure their further survival as sovereign Indigenous communities. So I just really love the way he captured that, and I asked him, I share it in my presentations, and he said, yes, you may. So consideration for land acknowledgements in courses. So we could do a whole presentation on land acknowledgements in general, land acknowledgements in various capacities and spaces. But I wanted to share with you the land acknowledgement I provide in my course, in my syllabus. So that picture is a picture of what I call our Bosque Beach. So wherever you're at, you're on Indigenous land. And we like to always remind each other to remember that. So it was pretty neat. In the student experience fellowship I was a part of, they promoted land acknowledgement, and this was an Indigenous based fellowship. So I really tried to run with it as far as I could. So for me, I include the university's land acknowledgement. That's what you see on the right side of the screen, and places you could find it. I link to AISS, I link to the DEI homepage where our brown and white papers are included that were written by Native faculty. But as Native faculty for ourselves, we want to push it a step further to say, it's just not token acknowledgement, it's true acknowledgement. And so for me, I add this statement of respect, gratitude, and UNM relationships. So I say, as a relative, I acknowledge, recognize, and honor the lands, languages, ways of knowing, prayers, and families of the Sandia, Isleta, and Santa Ana Pueblo nations, whose resources the majority of our university buildings occupy. Furthermore, I give thanks to all Indigenous peoples who share their spaces to make this course possible. So sometimes I have colleagues, from these fellowships or other circles that I get involved in, and they say, well, I want to include a land acknowledgement, but I don't want it to be just like surface level. And so I say, well, just share your personal truth and what that means for you. And so that's me trying to do that as a relative. And then some of the other critiques we also hear about land acknowledgement is like, well, what is the university really doing about it? And so for me, I speak to myself as an individual, what I'm really trying to do in my capacities. And so you see me listing all those positions I involve myself in. So this fellowship I was a part of was called eCure, and this is about building research experience into undergraduate coursework we do that a lot in Native Studies. We require a 200 level course, a 400 level course, and then also a final like internship or individual study to graduate from NAS. Sangtree was one of my teaching assistants along the way as one of her as her internship. She helped me with this course I'm presenting now. So thanks, Sangtree. So anyways, I wanted to see if I could really push that research experience or embed it into this intro level course, just to, you know, get that framework going and get students to see themselves as researchers from the very beginning. So it's pretty neat. This program was founded or funded, not founded, funded by STEM grants. And so they kind of had to find special funding for me to be able to participate. And I'm really proud of the way I was able to do that, because, you know, I've always been not necessarily the most front and center scholar type person in the room. I'm more of like a laid back, quiet, let's hear what everyone else has to say. From what I was able to do and produce in this fellowship, they wanted to highlight it. So they shared it in the next cohort in 2021, and it was one of 3 examples that they shared out of over 25 fellows in the program. So again, I'm just, you know, really proud of that. One of those things where I'm like, oh, I don't want to like talk too big of myself, but you kind of have to if I want to be successful in the PNT process. So that's that. Anyways, moving along. So I do have data to back up, you know, that this course was successful in pushing the students having their research identities, having that grow. So there were strong increases in the sense of the role that students had in planning and directing research. There was strong increases in the importance of research being carried out, and growth in the sense of belonging to a community of researchers. I'll give you a little bit more detail on what that really was in some later slides, but I just wanted to highlight that right away. In the syllabus, this is the language I use to introduce the ECure aspect of the course. And I won't read the whole thing, but I will read the highlighted part, which is probably kind of hard to see. Research is highly valued and embedded throughout our UNM NAS degree programs. The research experience in this course will be an opportunity for students to become familiar with and practice assessing community wellness through an NAS-centered research paradigm that also intersects with various disciplines. So in this course, prior to ECure, I had this building toward designing a community wellness program for a hypothetical Native nation. Through ECure, I decided to make it more research-based. So the research question that I presented to the students, and you can just look at this middle, is what are the best practices for Indigenous community wellness? In your team, you'll refine this research question based on the relationships you each have to the topic. You will research what is known, identify what else you need to know, find new information or data, analyze your findings, and present them in the form of a slideshow. So this is just like nothing too crazy and deep, but more, like I said, just to get everyone's toes wet and to see themselves as researchers. So this is pretty much the layout of my course. We begin with an exploration of identity. I want to acknowledge Dr. Lloyd Lee. He is like the identity guru, and you know, his class Politics of Identity, it's like a must take for anyone who goes through the NAS program. I cover it a little bit. And then we do some research on NAS programs. I'll go into that a little bit more. And then we go into special place and language. I'll talk about that in detail in future slides. Federal policy timeline and Hawaiian sovereignty. Oh man, I wish I could share some of the examples with you on that. But basically the way I tie it to the research process is I ask students to think about how does policy impact community wellness? So if we think of community wellness, you know, as maybe language being a central tenet of community wellness, speaking our native languages. We can tie it back to different points in time of federal Indian policy, specifically, like boarding schools, allotment, assimilation, where that impacted our languages or our ability to sustain ourselves off the land and our ways of being. So we can tie it back to those things. And then we go into what I call the princess activity. So we can deconstruct terms like squaw. I hate to say these terms out loud. The R word, what the Washington DC team used to be called, or the noble savage, terms like that. We deconstruct them, and then we tie it to those representations in film. And then I share a film by my good friend and colleague Donovan Barney, which is counter to that. It's an Indigenous-centered film on generational experiences, intergenerational experiences of the long walk. And so, so through that, we start to identify each other's core values. And this is where you see that our Native students end up becoming the course because they share their experience with their identity, their special place, their relationship to language, their family history and federal policy and timeline. And the non-Native students get to really get to experience it from the reading, but more so from reading the discussion that's happening in the discussion forum. And it's a community where it doesn't feel like students are being objectified in what they share, because the non-Native students share just as much. So again, we start to learn more about core values, more about how we define community wellness. We look at American history and, how would we categorize American history as it pertains to Native peoples. So I look for students to identify things like individualism, land, the taking of land, things like that. So then we have a unit on Alcatraz and UNDRIP to really kind of connect back activism, that it's always been there. It's been there all along. And a lot of the students say, I didn't know about Alcatraz. And so that's where they're learning. Or they learn like, oh, wow, my family members were involved with Alcatraz. I didn't know that. And then we end the course with a decolonization forum. So students think about, what is it about decolonization that students will take with them in their future pathways? Going back to the beginning where they begin their research process with researching Native Studies programs. Like I promised, I said I would introduce our faculty. So we have our chair, Dr. Tiffany Lee. She's pretty much a rock star in Native Studies and Indigenous education. Dr. Lloyd Lee produces a book like every other year, if not every year. So he's really well known as well. And then Dr. Gray Eyes has a book coming out, The History of Navajo Education, Disentangling Our Sovereign Body. So look out for that. So, we have amazing people in our department. Unfortunately, Dr. Melanie Yazzie moved on to another position, but she was just equally sensational. So I wanted to mention her. And the reason I mention everyone is because I ask students to research our department, based on websites, research other NAS or AIS websites, and then identify what type of department is it? Is it a department? For UNM, most of the time, students are able to correctly identify that according to Dwayne Champagne's categories, we do qualify as being a departmental model, full-fledged department, because we're a core of committed faculty that are full-time in NAS. And then there's this other note, this quote I'll read. The funding of AIS puts the administration of AIS programs directly in the hands of university administrators who, for the most part, are not well schooled in the history, culture, or law affecting Native Americans. So kind of like with the history of federal Indian policy, it can go back and forth. Right now, I feel like we're in pretty good position to have support of leaders all the way, you know, from our chair to our dean, our provost, our president. We still got to advocate for ourselves, but less than what's 2017, about less than 5 years ago, that wasn't the case. You see us here all happy, us with Dr. Catherine Montoya. We fundraised at the Tsinnajinnie, the Striking Eagle tournament, so that we could pay for our own way to go to a conference at the Six Nations in Canada. So that was us. We sold nachos, hot dogs, Frito pies, all kinds of stuff just to make that trip possible because we didn't have the funding embedded in the university. So I just put together a bunch of pictures that I felt like represented my life as an NAS professor. I won't go into each one, but I, some of the great honors I've been able to have is to give high school commencement speeches at Cuba High School, Wingate High School, St. Michael's High School, and being able to meet up with Indigenous educators who are Filipino through Bernalillo Public Schools. So, so you see that in the bottom left side of your screen next to the food. And then there's like contingencies everywhere, including Cuba. So I'm able to connect with people from Cuba High School who are Filipino as well. Right above that picture, you see me. I was the president of the American Indian Studies Association for 1 year. So, service work is just so much fun. That picture of the roast mutton sandwich in the top left of the screen, that's from traveling to Shiprock with my IE colleagues to report back on forums we had with them and just to recommit ourselves, to the work we're doing and the relationships we're trying to have throughout the state. Oh, this isn't part of my presentation right now. It's just a slide I wanted to share from a motivational talk I gave to the Cuba school district community. And I was able to share quotes from some of my various publications to tell my story. So it was just really nice to be able to do that. And there were this little girl who was on the Zoom, and she drew a picture of me and she held it up, and it was just really touching to be able to do that. And I just, again, it speaks to that power that we can have in a virtual environment, even though it might not seem so. So we have our mission and our values broken down into a rubric. I won't go into it too much, but I wanted to share more of my colleagues, Dr. Kahete, who is retired now, and Dr. Robin Ninthorn, who's at the University of Washington, Tacoma now, because it's been built over decades, right? And I just wanted to make sure that I shared some of the background and some of the research that our students find as they dig into our program. So now I'm going to get more into some of the other fellowship tools that I learned from the Student Experience Project. And so this is really about honoring students from as many backgrounds as possible, and doing that from the very beginning, from our syllabus. So this is some language that's embedded into my syllabus. I'm going to go ahead and read it. You will find many specific expectations and requirements in the remainder of the syllabus. While this is a challenging course, I know you will have the ability to be successful from whatever educational, cultural, or social background you are coming from. Please reach out to me if you find yourself in need of guidance. I have had the need to do so multiple times in my educational experiences. So just being as inviting as possible in your syllabus is one of the tools that I was taught and I've been applying, and it's been really successful for me. In these pandemic times, especially, I haven't had, knock on wood, a single case where a student reached out to me and asked for extended time, and I've granted it every single time. And every single time the students have been able to complete the course because they reached out to me and communicated with me. If they kind of just didn't, then that wasn't the same case. But with me trying to be inviting from the syllabus to any other way I can, it's really made a difference, and I'll share some data on that towards the end. But I wanted to go into identity, and this is one of the really key lessons that we begin with. So we break down identity into there's three ways that we can look at it, at least according to Hillary Weaver in the reading that they do. So you've got your self-identity, how you identify yourself, your community identity, how others maybe recognize or don't recognize you, and then your external identity. So your external identity, could rely, sometimes students say, external identity is like how people might judge me based on my appearance. They might say, you're not Native. You don't look phenotypically Native, based on whatever conceptions people have of what a Native should look like. Or my non-Native students will talk about how they're stereotyped or they're identified based on their street race. And street race I get from Dr. Nancy Lopez. So, as you're walking down the street, how you could be perceived by others, in a real racialized way. And in this way, I'm really able to connect with a lot of my students who come from mixed backgrounds, and, that can cause an intersectionality of experiences for them. And I openly share that with them as much as I possibly can. And then you see my stepdaughter, Mia, on the right. We study Mount Shasta, from David Wilson in the reader that I provide. And it's about a sacred mountain that has become a place for corporate development. So, that's the reading. And then the activity is, I say, okay, everyone think of the place that's most sacred to you, in the whole wide world, and describe it and share it. And then say what you would do if that place was threatened by corporate development. So a lot of students share something similar to what I shared here. This is Torreon. This is outside my family's home area. And of course, that's my heart and soul. That's where I come from, and where I will always consider home. So a lot of students, share a similar sentiment, and they share pictures of something similar land. This is my picture of the Sandia Mountains, but most recently I've had Sandia students share pictures of the Sandia Mountains. The picture in the middle is from the Pine Hill, Rama, Navajo area, where my Navajo goddaughter had her kinalta. The picture on the right is of a lake, and oftentimes a lot of my non-Native students will share a picture of a lake or a beach or a waterfall. Sometimes Native too, and then I have this picture of one of the protests, the No DAPL protests of No Blood for Oil, again going back to what would you do if this place was threatened. And the reason this activity is so powerful is because a lot of students will share, like, this is what I would do if this happened. And it's good, right? But a lot of other students will share, this did happen to me or my family, and this is what they had to do with, from fracking to Blue Lake to other instances of, this was a reality for me and my family. So students were really able to learn from each other, like, wow, this is real life. This is real stuff that has impact on real communities. And so one of my non-Native students shared with me, he said, usually, like, if I hear about something, I'll read about it in the news, but I'll just think, this is in his words, he'll say, I'll just think, oh yeah, that's too bad, that sucks, that's unfortunate. But from experiencing the class and the activity in this way, he says it makes him want to do something about it. So more pictures. So special place is connected to home, which is connected to family and foundation. So oftentimes when people describe their special place, they end up describing their families or the core values of their families. The black and white picture is of me and some of my students at the ASA conference. So I think most of them ended up going through this class I'm talking about right now. So just going into anti-racism and Native American studies. So this was me going on a walk, and this was like a year and a half ago. PED was getting a bunch of us together to talk about revamping the social studies standards. And you might see now there's a lot of pushback because it's like, oh no, it's the boogeyman, critical race theory. They're trying to change these standards and make people feel bad about being white or whatnot. It's anti-whiteness. But anyways, early on in the conversation about talking about revamping the standards, I was just trying to listen and take a walk, deal with my life, whatever I had going on. Multitask, right? But someone made the comment about ethnic studies, and he said ethnic studies was just all about victimization. So I was like, okay, great. And I unmuted myself and I was like, I have something to say. So this is me saying something about ethnic studies is about empowerment, not victimization. So if we're looking at critical race theory through an Indigenous perspective, most of us like to turn to Brian Brayboy's work on tribal crit. So looking at how colonization is endemic to society, it's just so embedded into our society, it becomes invisible. So you see that picture with me, Dr. Brian Brayboy, Dr. Curtis at his defense, my one picture with Brian Brayboy, so I thought I'd use it. I gave a presentation on tribal crit when I was a part of the ACLU New Mexico Board of Directors. And then the reason I include myself, my graduation picture, is that's when we still had that old seal that depicted the frontiersman and conquistador. So both on my gown and in the seal behind me. And, I didn't even realize that because it was just so embedded, so invisible. And then the duck pond, I share that because we had the duck pond incident back in the early 2000s, where there was some performers, Native performers, and a student came out and he said something super racial. He said, "That's why we put you effing monkeys on reservations." And it was a huge racist incident, but it really turned the university upside down, and NAS was part of that, front and center part of it. So anyways, in the modules, I cover racism and anti-racism through examining federal Indian policy, Hawaiian sovereignty, the terms that I mentioned earlier, Dr. Beverly Singer's work on wiping the war paint off the lens. So really looking at Hollywood movies and depictions of natives in there, revisiting Alcatraz and decolonization. Okay, and then this is our statement of solidarity. The work that I've been doing with the team I mentioned earlier, we call ourselves Team Crits. We've done presentations and ongoing professional development with Cuba, my home community, Dr. Rito's, or the district that serves our home communities. We presented to a school district in southern New Mexico, northern New Mexico, and like I said before, Santa Fe Community College, just samples of the learning outcomes that we're hoping participants walk away with. That's a picture of my virtual office. I have different office spaces in my home, but that's one of them. And like I said, it looks cold and lonely and kind of funny, but we create that community of the stories I've been telling you. I thought that looked like a heart and an angel, just, symbolic of the heartfelt community. So syllabus language. So I share my plans in the syllabus in English. I probably should get it written in Navajo and include that too. But I also share that I'm married into Damaya, and my family and I live close by to the Pueblo. In the top right, you see a picture of my great-grandma, my grandma, and my mom and myself. I believe that's in Kauai. And then I also, share to be inviting to the non-Diné or the non-natives that I also have relationships in other ways. Maybe it's through mutual interests, studies, experiences, dreams. Like sometimes people say they're into martial arts or kickboxing, and I say, hey, I do that for fun. I don't really fight, but I do it for fitness. So, I find a way to connect to my students in whatever way possible. So more food pictures. You see Filipino food, that's lumpia. Navajo reception food, and then a picture of my grandma in boarding school at Albuquerque Indian School. So more on the modules, I already talked about identity, special place, core values, but just speak your language. I mentioned language before. Dr. Richard Littlebear talks about, 7 ways that we need to take action to save our language. And so I tell my students, pick one way that really resonates you and describe what it means to you in your experience or what it means to you as an NAS scholar. So again, that's another area where my students will share personal and even raw experiences in terms of what it's been like. So in the research project, what the students end up doing is they'll create a hypothetical community wellness project with a $30 million budget. And I just pulled that because we found out, we think that's how much the Tsinnajinnie Wellness Center cost to build. And that's what you see at the very top middle of the screen. It was raining. Me and my husband ran a duathlon at Jemez. I did another Jemez run. I came in last place. And then I did a run at Rama. I came in last place too. It's just fun to share because I just love native runs, but they're so hard. And then a picture of yummy food and, just thinking, what does it take in terms of knowledge and culture and planning, to produce a table with all that food. I threw in Jonathan Nez, President Nez, because he likes running. You see that he all the knowledge it takes to butcher, come up with those recipes. That middle picture you see of the kids, those are my kids getting food at the wellness center during an event that was held on by New Mexico Community Capital on how to promote your own business. So, there's so many ways that a wellness center, if it's like a physical center, can be used. And most of the time, the students always mention efforts that go back to cultural education, language, so on. So the eCure survey data, I won't go into the detail, but in 3 of the questions, the research mindedness went up by, in the first one, over 30%, second one, over 50%, and then the third one, over 26%. Safe, accessible learning. So the virtual space, the cream of wheat, spam, and corned beef, that's from a distribution we got from Santa Ana. So I have a statement on the pandemic and on violence against BIPOC. There's a rubric that we use to get our courses certified. It's 21 pages long, and I won't go into that, but I do want to just show, this is all backed by research in order to get these courses approved. I put a picture of me and my dog because in reviewing other people's courses to get certification, a lot of instructors put pictures of themselves and their pets, and then a lot of my students like to put their pets. So I thought that would be fun to include in here. Okay, SEP data. I'm going to go ahead and jump to the big impact slide. So there were like 30 or so fellows from UNM, and that's what you see on the left side. And then my data is on the right side, and I was for the efforts in this class, collective effort, not just me, but everyone's contributed to this. I was second in the social belonging category, growth mindset category, tied for first, and then again, second in the next category and very high in the others. So you see huge jumps compared to, the university at large. I was asked to give a university-wide presentation on our efforts. So that's an infographic I made. And then just some excerpts from a couple of my book chapters. Another excerpt. So that's me and my son, a picture of educational sovereignty. So I'll just read one of these quotes. We are a nation building community of students, educators, and political leaders committed to protecting Indigenous languages, core values, and ways of being. We might also be healers, apprentices of healers, traditional leaders, community mothers, elders who are the heart of a nation, caretakers, or cultural educators. We allow for each individual to find ways of channeling their gifts deep into our collective work and prayer. So on that note, I wanted to thank my family and community, IAIE, and for all of you, thank you so much for being here. And if there's any comments or questions, I'm open to receiving those. But thank you all so much.